Good evening. Welcome to a talk and a presentation which promises to be one of the most outstanding talks and presentations in the history of the President's Lecture Series. As you know, this is indeed part of the President's Lecture Series, and therefore we have to thank first and foremost our President, President George Dennison, who has always graciously supported this series with not only financial but moral and intellectual support. We thank you, President Dennison. I would also like to extend my personal thanks to my dear friend and colleague, Professor Richard Drake, the chair and a member of the History Department at the University of Montana, without whom these lecture series would have been impossible. Thank you very much, Richard. I would also like to extend my thanks and our thanks as an institution to Helen Cappadocia, who has supported this program in memory of her husband, Ezio, who was a magnificent historian and teacher. Thank you very much, Helen. Tonight, on the 6th anniversary of the terrorist attacks on the United States, we are here to listen to one of the most distinguished professors and scholars and experts on a very important country of Afghanistan. While Washington is filled with the buzz about Iraq, I think the real front on terrorism at times is forgotten. That is Afghanistan. Professor Barnett Rubin is Director of Studies and Senior Fellow at the Center on International Cooperation, CIC, of New York University, NYU, where he directs the program on reconstruction of Afghanistan. He has worked at CIC since July 2000. During 1994 to 2000, he was the director of the Center for Preventive Action and director of Peace and Conflict Studies at the Council of the Foreign Relations in New York. Professor Rubin was Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for the Study of Central Asia at Columbia University from 1990 to 1996. Previously, he was a Jennings Randolph Peace Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace and Assistant Professor of Political Science at Yale University. Dr. Rubin is the director of Golestan Ariana Ltd., a private company manufacturing essential oils and related consumer products in Afghanistan. In November-December 2001, he served as special advisor to the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan, Lakhdar Brahimi. During the negotiations that produced the very well-known Bonn Agreement, he advised the United Nations on the drafting of the Constitution for Afghanistan, the Afghanistan Compact, and the Afghanistan National Development Strategy. Dr. Rubin received his PhD and MA from the University of Chicago and a BA from Yale University. He is currently the chair of the Conflict Prevention and Peace Forum, a program of the Social Science Research Council, a member of the Executive Board of Human Rights Watch Asia, and the board of the Open Society Institute's Central Eurasia Project. During 1996-98, he served on the Secretary of State's Advisory Committee on Religious Freedom Abroad. Dr. Rubin is the author of Blood on the Doorstep, The Politics of Preventing Violent Conflict. He is also the author of The Fragmentation of Afghanistan, State Formation and Collapse in the International System. He is also the author of Calming the Farghana Valley, Development and Dialogue in the Heart of Central Asia, the author of Stabilizing Nigeria, Sanctions, Incentives, and Support for Civil Society. He is also the author of Post-Soviet Political Order, Conflict and State Building, the author of Cases and Strategies for Preventive Action, and also the author of Toward Comprehensive Peace in Southeast Europe, Conflict Prevention in the South Balkans, and also the author of The Search for Peace in Afghanistan, From Buffer State to Failed State. Dr. Rubin has written numerous articles and book reviews on conflict prevention, state formation, and human rights. His articles have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Orbis, Survival, International Affairs, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Review of Books. It is therefore my greatest honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Barnett Rubin.
Well, thank you a lot for that introduction. Maybe I should just stop now, but I have a few pictures to show you. A couple introductory points. First, I of course, as Professor Kia said, I have been involved in the situation in Afghanistan not only as a scholar, and actually not even originally as a scholar. My dissertation actually was about India, but as originally an activist for human rights organizations, and then in collaboration with international organizations. And because of my long association with the country, going back almost 25 years now, I do personally know a lot of the main political actors there and in the region around Afghanistan as well. So I do know a lot about events, and I can give some insight into the background to current affairs. But in thinking about what to talk about today, I decided to do something a little bit different. First of all, because as you know, there's just been 2 videos released by Osama bin Laden, 2 new videos. The most recent one was not that interesting, I thought, actually, speaking as a film critic. But the previous one that came out last week I thought was quite interesting. I wrote a blog about it on the internet. I now am part of a group blog called Informed Comment Global Affairs, and I titled my blog about it, Crossover Dreams, UBL Rebans al-Qaeda and Anti-Global Market Share Grab. Because in that video, many people have noted that he did not really, while he used Islamic language to frame his appeals, his appeal was actually to everyone who has a grievance in the entire world. You know, he talked about the problem of global warming. For the left, he talked about the domination of capital and imperialism. For the right, he talked about the fact that taxes are too high, and in an Islamic state, taxes would be lower. Of course, family values and morals, and basically was proposing his version of Islam as a political solution to all the ailments of the world. You may have noted that there was there were a series of arrests in Germany last week of people affiliated with al-Qaeda who were planning attacks on U.S. air bases in Frankfurt. Now, if you listen to the administration, you would think that, well, these are part of the terrorists, so therefore perhaps they were from Hamas, Palestine, or from Hezbollah in Lebanon, or maybe they were from Taliban in Afghanistan, or from some other Middle East, maybe they were Iranian agents or something. But actually, they weren't from any of those places. They consisted of the sons of Turkish immigrants to Germany who had grown up in Germany, and some German converts to Islam. That is, they consisted of Europeans, including some of whom were were immigrants from Islamic countries. And this is more the profile that we now see of the new recruits to al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is not, and we actually do ourselves a disservice politically by trying to understand al-Qaeda as just an extension of all these various national, religious, and political struggles in the Islamic world. It is much more than that. And in a sense, it is less than that, because all those struggles are not connected to al-Qaeda. They have their local and national roots. But al-Qaeda is a global, non-governmental, transnational movement, which in a sense is a radical Islamist version of the anti-globalization movement. I don't mean everyone who's against free trade is a terrorist. I'm not trying to say that. But in any movement, there is a large range of people who are attracted to it for one way or another. Now, where does Afghanistan fit into this? Of course, Osama bin Laden, you may be aware, is not Afghan. In fact, as far as I know, there's not a single Afghan member of al-Qaeda, and never has been. That isn't always clear to people. I remember in the fall of 2001, I was invited down to Washington. Well, I was invited many times, but one of the times I was invited was by one of the congressional delegation from New York, Nita Lowey, and I had lunch with some of the members of the House. And I remember trying to explain to one of the representatives from Los Angeles that it was not the Taliban who bombed the World Trade Center. Actually, there were no Afghans involved in the bombing of the World Trade Center. Nonetheless, it was planned and organized from Afghanistan. So there is a connection. So what I want to talk about is what that connection is and what it means for this title here, what are the stakes in Afghanistan. And just to give you a preview so you're not kept guessing too much, the overall framework that I'll be talking about is that Afghanistan became the center of organization for this transnational network, the center of which is now in the tribal areas of Pakistan, because it was an area where the institutions of the international state system were extremely weak, where they delivered very little to the people, where they had few resources, and therefore it became a kind of gap in the global system. And it's not an accident that bin Laden, as a critic, and not just a critic, it's a bit weak term, I guess, as a revolutionary opponent of that global system, is now located at its weakest point. But he's not someone who's trying to drag the world back into medieval times. If it wasn't for the internet, satellite communications, jet travel, and electronic bank transfers, he wouldn't be able to do what he is now doing. And it's that in particular satellite communications and electronic transfers that enable someone to be physically present in what appears to be an isolated area and yet be globally connected at the same time. And that is what we have to understand this movement. Similarly, Afghanistan is often depicted, in fact, normally depicted in media, as being a place where people are still living in the Middle Ages. I just saw some National Geographic slideshow about, actually it was about the tribal territories of Pakistan, but it was the same idea. And because everybody there doesn't have electricity and they wear different kinds of clothes, they said these people are living exactly the same way as they lived 1,000 years ago. So I wondered, 1,000 years ago, were they making compact disc images of people being beheaded and putting them on the internet? I don't think so. Were they engaged in international trade in an illicit substance, opium, which had mass markets all the way around on the other side of the world, and were they linked to that by chains of money laundering, corruption, and marketing? I don't think so. So those people are quite fully integrated into our modern world, but because of our position in the modern world, we tend to, we sort of identify it as being those parts of it that benefit us. But it doesn't look that way to everyone. And the fact that it doesn't look that way to everyone is a reason why some people are attracted to ideas that seem to us to be extreme. And I'll try to bring that out. Now, first, when I was preparing this lecture, of course, which partly is taking place, as Professor Kia mentioned, due to the generosity of Helen Cappadocia, I got a message from her through the sponsors that I should have some maps. And perhaps I overdid it. Because I have quite a few maps here now. But I want to give you an idea first of what is this Afghanistan we're talking about. And I'm going to be moving back and forth between a kind of long view historically and even the physical environment and a current view. So we see where these current events may fit not only in today's news but also in the long view. So let's just take the first question. Let's go back. What is this Afghanistan? Well, Afghanistan, of course, is the name of a state. That's what it is now. The term itself had many different meanings. If you think of the word America, that's had a lot of different meanings over time, starting with the name of Amerigo Vespucci. Afghanistan has had at least as many names as the word America. Today, it's the name of a state. What's a state? Something we take for granted. Namely, it's a specific demarcated territory that is ruled by a government which exercises something we call sovereignty and is a member of the United Nations. And that's not the way the world has always been organized. In the 17th century in that region, there were empires. There was the Mughal Empire in India. There was the Safavid Empire in Iran. There was the Uzbek Empire in Central Asia. They formed and then they dissolved. They didn't have borders. They had frontiers because they would kind of just peter out. Their control would sort of peter out toward areas where they had less control, and then there would be ungoverned frontiers. The idea that, and there would be territory that was contested or wasn't clear who it belonged to. States would rise and fall. There was no idea of that once a state existed, it had a right to maintain its territorial integrity, which is now a basic principle of the international system. In fact, much of the business of states was removing the territorial integrity of other states. That was one of their essential tasks, in fact. These things that we now kind of take for granted are actually the political result of developments that have taken place relatively recently. In particular, this territory we now call Afghanistan was demarcated between 1879 and 1901, and I will go through that process of demarcation, which was a very political process. But first, let's look at what this territory actually consists of. Now, this is a satellite view of Afghanistan, probably in the summer, I would guess, judging by the amount of snow that is there or is not there. And of course, how does this thing work? Oh, wrong side. Okay, here we go. Thank you. Of course, this is Central Asia up here. This is the river between Afghanistan and the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Down here, of course, this is the Indus River, the Indus Valley, which is one of the great centers of ancient civilization in India. Today, this is Pakistan. Over here is Iran as well. Now, these mountains are historically known as the Mountains of the Indus, or the Hindu Kush. Alexander the Great came here, and they're part of the whole chain of mountains, including the Himalayas, that resulted from the collision of the Indian subcontinent with the Asian landmass. And they divide these areas, all of which are relatively fertile and have become densely populated, from this area where, as we will see, populate because of the presence of high mountains, a small amount of water, and this area is desert. This area is mountains, and this area is desert. The population and the agricultural production is relatively low. Here's a picture of a diagram of Afghanistan showing where, this is from the period of drought in the late 1990s, but it still gives you an idea where there is various kinds of cultivation and so on. And it's only in these few dark green areas that you actually have cultivation because there's sufficient water. In the lighter green areas, you have grassland or shrubland, which is used for pasturage of animals, and then much of these areas is desert and not actually inhabited. And this area is high mountains and so on. So what you have is a relatively large area, about the size of France or Texas. I gather France and Texas are the same size, something that is not widely known, in which you have people that are very largely dispersed and separated from each other. Here you see the pattern of settlement. Now, today, of course, Afghanistan is much more urbanized than this territory has ever been before. But the basic pattern of settlement, and here you see the color coding, is what it has always been. There are a few areas. Here is Kabul, here is Herat, here is Mazar Sharif, Balkh, Here is Kandahar. A few areas which are in oases with relatively plentiful water, which are where rivers come together, where trade routes come together, where markets form, where you have settled populations. In between, you see people settled very sparsely in those mountain valleys that you saw earlier. And the control of water in particular, which is the main scarce resource, is what has determined the pattern of human settlement. It determines the productivity of agriculture, and therefore determines the distribution of population. We can compensate for many things with modern technology, but so far we have not come up with a substitute for water. We have better ways of moving water around, but there's no substitute for it, and we can't create it out of nothing. Wrong button. Let's see. Now what? Okay. There we go. Now, partly as a result of the distribution of the population in this way, Afghanistan has been settled over history by many different peoples. It has many different language groups, and any diagram like this is very inaccurate. But it's better than nothing, because, of course, in the same village, you will often have people from different ethnicities and different language groups, which, of course, you cannot depict on a diagram such as this. But this gives you an idea of, in the broadest categories, what type of people are living there. The group that actually developed the state in Afghanistan since the 18th century is the Pashtuns. As you see, they now live across all of southern and eastern Afghanistan, and also in Pakistan. There are more Pashtuns actually in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. There may be, no one knows, there's never been a census in Afghanistan. No one has defined what it means to be a member of an ethnic group in Afghanistan, and no one has ever counted it. So all numbers like what the proportion of the population is are pretty arbitrary. But just to give you an order of magnitude, it appears that about half the population of Afghanistan is more or less Pashtun in some way or another, maybe slightly less than half. Pashto is a language which is similar to, it's an Iranian language, but an Eastern Iranian language. It's similar to the languages that are spoken up here and also in Kurdistan. The state, however, historically and civilizationally, and this doesn't come out so much from this diagram, Afghanistan belonged to the Persian-speaking cultural area. It is distinct from Iran, in particular because Iran has been Shia since the beginning of the 16th century, as we count centuries, and Afghanistan remained a Sunni society. But nonetheless, even though many people spoke Pashto and Turkish languages and so on, Persian was the language of the main cities of Kabul, Herat, Balkh, even of Kandahar and through the 19th century. And it was the language of high culture and of government. So in a sense, Afghanistan is the Eastern Iranian cultural zone, although it's not well known in this country either. In Iran also, Persians are barely a majority. You know, there's a very large population of Turkic people and other kinds of ethnic Baluch and so on in Iran as well. Iran is not an ethnically uniform country, but Persian was the language of the state, of high culture and so on, from Iran all the way to North India for many centuries. Now, so you also have people whose daily language is Persian, so-called Tajiks here. This group here, Hazaras, who are Shia, Turkic groups, Uzbeks and Turkmen up there, and then a lot of other smaller groups. I won't go into the detail. That's just to give you an idea. Now, so you have a country which is sparsely populated and is ethnically extremely diverse. Why is it a country? That's the question. Why is it a country? Now, again, we have an assumption. I don't want to tell you what you think. I shouldn't do that. But if I analyze discourse, you can see that because we consider the nation state, in a sense, as the natural unit of politics, we have a discourse about nationalism and state, which implies that every state that now exists is a representative of the people who are its citizens, who constitute a nation. But actually, of course, states were constituted in different ways. Recently, I had an occasion to think about this because I was in Istanbul at a conference on the Durand Line. Now, the Durand Line, named for an Englishman, quite appropriately, Sir Henry Mortimer Durand. Where's the button on this thing? Here it is. The Durand Line is this line here, which is the line that today separates Afghanistan and Pakistan to the extent that they are separate, which is not much. I'll come back to that. And this Durand Line, which was drawn by Sir Henry Mortimer Durand in 1893, has never been recognized by Afghanistan. I'm sorry, the Durand Line is over here, my mistake, on the other side. Has never been recognized by Afghanistan as an international border. I'll show you other depictions of the Durand Line more clearly later. I'll explain what this map is a little bit. But that Durand Line, we were discussing the Durand Line because it's become a political issue again, because that's where Osama bin Laden is, right? Osama bin Laden is in this area on either side of the Durand Line. He's in what we call the tribal areas of Pakistan now, which is an area that Afghanistan has made territorial claims on in the past and that Pakistan does not actually govern. That's where he is sitting. And the relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan are very complex, not as you might think because President Karzai and President Musharraf cannot get along with each other and therefore need to be taken to dinner at the White House so they learn to like each other better, but because Afghanistan and Pakistan have had hostile relations for as long as those two countries existed, largely because of the issue of the demarcation of this frontier, originally between Afghanistan and India, which involves the ethnic identity of Pashtuns, the national identity of Pakistan, and the national identity of Afghanistan. So this line, pretty obscure place, has now become the center of global conflict. One of the most marginal and unknown places in the world, which, as I mentioned, is depicted by the National Geographic as being lost in time and history, is now the center of global conflict. It's where Osama bin Laden is making his videos. So we had a conference about this area in Istanbul. And of course, one of the things we mentioned is that the people living on either side of that line don't recognize it as a border. And from their point of view, and remember, they have their own point of view, which may not be the legal point of view of the international state system. They were there, their ancestors were there, their tribes were there, long before these states were there. Certainly before there was a Pakistan, which has only been around for 60 years. Even before there was an Afghanistan within these borders, which has only been around, depending on how you count it, since the 19th or the 18th century. And what they wonder gave an Englishman the right to draw a line here that divides them and says, since they have tribes that are on both sides of this line, they speak the same language, same culture, they have economic relations, family relations, why does an Englishman have the right to come and draw a line that divides them? So the local people still do not recognize this line. In fact, I was told a story by a colleague of mine, an anthropologist at Boston University, who was taking a bus up through those areas of Pakistan one time, and he was on this bus with all these guys with huge turbans and so on, and he's sitting next to a guy, and the guy says to him, "You know, we are Pashtuns." And my colleague said, "Yes, I had observed that." And the guy said, "You know what makes us Pashtuns?" He said, "What?" He said, "We don't carry papers, and we don't carry IDs." It means their essential part of their identity was not recognizing the authority of states. They were there before the states. Now, at this time I was in Turkey. These are not quite in the order I wish they were in, so here we're going. Okay, I was in Turkey, and I was staying at this hotel along the Straits of Bosporus. Here's my hotel. This is the scene from my hotel. And as I was there, I took this picture. This, of course, is the entrance to the Golden Horn. Right behind me was the center of the Ottoman Empire, the Blue Mosque and the Topkapi Palace. It was all in walking distance of this. And here is this very important shipping lane. And our hotel, we were watching this shipment going through here. And this is a container ship. You can't read it here, but on these containers, it's marked Maersk, M-A-E-R-S-K, which is a very big Scandinavian shipping company. And I was quite struck by it and took the picture because this container was traveling out of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. Perhaps it was coming from Odessa in what is now Ukraine, I don't know. That's where my great-grandfather actually was born. So he used to be a grain inspector in the port of Odessa, so he might have been loading some of those ships. Actually, that was my wife's great-grandfather, was a grain inspector. Mine left when he was younger in order to avoid the draft. I was particularly taken by the fact that it was Maersk because in April 2006, I was here. Now, this is another picture that I took, and that is the road between Kabul and Jalalabad. I was driving to Jalalabad with a friend of mine who's head of the Afghanistan Investment Support Agency, is actually a Canadian-trained Afghan economist who's from Jalalabad. And we were taking this road, which is the same road that was taken by the British Army in 1841 when they retreated from Kabul and were massacred by the Afghan Mujahideen on their way back, the Lataband Pass. And as we were going down this road, unfortunately I didn't know I'd be here and needed to take the exact correct picture, so I took this one instead. So here you see a fuel truck, but what I actually did see there, though I neglected to take a picture of it, was many container trucks carrying containers of the Maersk shipping company. In other words, the same ones I saw here were going up this road, which is the road that crosses the Durand line and goes over the Khyber Pass. So this is an illustration of how this area, which was once considered very remote, has actually become integrated into global networks of trade and, of course, global networks of politics. It means that this frontier is not, as is often depicted, the unchanging Afghan frontier. Now, there have been efforts to keep the area isolated. In the 19th century, the Emir of Afghanistan, Amir Abdurrahman Khan, who was the king at the time that this line was demarcated, decided against developing roads like this and transport routes because he thought, quite accurately, the same roads on which trade could pass were the roads on which armies could pass. And to keep the country secure, to prevent armies from coming there, he decided not to develop this kind of transport. The British also wanted to keep Afghanistan isolated to assure that Russia would not enter an area that was on the border of their empire in India. So at that time, basically, Britain settled the Anglo-Afghan wars, there are two of them in the 19th century, which had to do with the security of the British Empire, by making an agreement to make Afghanistan subordinate to the British Empire in its foreign affairs and domestically autonomous and isolated so that no threat to the British Empire could enter the area. In other words, Afghanistan constituted the strategic depth of the British Empire in India. Now, you may have heard this term strategic depth, or you may not have. If you heard Ahmed Rashid speak here 4 years ago, I'm sure you heard it, because that is the same doctrine that is today the strategic doctrine of the military in Pakistan, who are the strategic heirs of the British Empire in that area, who also see Afghanistan as being their strategic depth against Iran, Russia, and also India, which has strong relations with the government in Afghanistan. Now, let me go back here. What happened? Slideshow, view show, okay. Okay. How do I go back? Must be the way. Previous, okay, figured it out. Okay, so back to this map. Now, what this map shows is, and we'll see a couple maps like this, this is a European map. This is a European map based on European ideas of statehood, which shows how the British government and the Russian government divided up this territory in the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1901. They agreed on this border between the British Empire here and Persia. This is the British sphere of influence. This is the Russian sphere of influence. This is neutral territory. Afghanistan was in the British sphere of influence, but not governed by Britain directly. And then this area on the other side was governed by Britain, with one exception. And that is what is today the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. Now, this is extremely important to understand the latest news about the Pakistani army surrendering to the Taliban in Pakistan, elements of it, about the political crisis in Pakistan, because this frontier is a relic of colonialism, but it is still structuring the relations between those states and among the peoples in this area. Now, this is a contemporary map, but it still shows remnants of that agreement from 1901. Because first, the British demarcated what they called a triple frontier. The idea was, remember, at that time there was no border between Pakistan and India. They were concerned about the security of India in relation to Russia, which was coming in from this direction. So first, the outer border of Afghanistan here was the strategic border of the British Empire. No one hostile to Britain could enter there. In other words, so Afghanistan was ruled by its emir, but its foreign relations was controlled by Delhi. So there was only an Indian emissary, an Indian Muslim actually, who was present in Kabul, no other foreign missions. This line, this is the Durand Line that I spoke of before, which was defined by a treaty as the area beyond which the emir of Afghanistan will not extend his administration. So there was no territorial administration beyond this. But there are people over here who are still Pashtuns and consider themselves Afghans. But they lived in mountainous areas, they lived in tribes, and the British also drew another line, which is this line here, beyond which they did not extend the administration of the British Empire. So these areas became tribal agencies. And after Pakistan became independent and became a federation with its capital in Islamabad, which is here, not shown here, they became federally administered tribal areas. Now, what does that mean? The law of Pakistan does not apply in those areas. Those areas are governed by what Pakistan calls tribal law. Actually, they are governed by something called the Frontier Crimes Regulations, which is a law promulgated by the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, in 1901, which is the British approximation of their understanding of tribal law. If any of you have been familiar with the history of colonialism, you know that very often colonial powers would try to control native peoples by writing down their supposedly traditional laws and then appointing traditional authorities to serve the interests of the colonial power. That is very much what they did here. But it means that this area is now ungoverned. There are Pakistani military people who represent the government in that area, but it is not governed by the laws of Pakistan. It is not open to the outside world. It does not participate. The people there do not have the civil rights, such as they are, insufficient, of the rest of the population of Pakistan. They can vote in national elections, but not on the basis of political parties, and national laws don't affect them. So, of course, voting for laws that don't affect you is not really a form of self-government. It's a kind of symbolic action. And this is the area that has now been turned into a major base area for the Taliban. Now, Okay. Now, by contrast, I just put this in, it's kind of an interesting historical document. This is also a map from the same period, but this is the map that Amir Abdurrahman Khan published himself in order to explain his rule of the people of Afghanistan. Now, you can see that he's not that concerned with accurate demarcation of the territory. It's not as if he couldn't have done it, because he very well could have, even if he didn't have adequate geographers in his camp. When he needed weapons, he hired people who knew how to make modern weapons, and he started a factory. So he could have hired modern geographers. But what this actually describes is not control over this demarcated territory, but the relation between the Amir and his people. That is, that he is an Islamic ruler enforcing Islam, and therefore they have the duty to obey him, and he's protecting the realm from the non-Islamic powers on its borders. So again, just bear in mind, this is just to mention, to relativize in a sense, the way that we depict power as being over demarcated territories and ending at a boundary, versus this way of depicting power as being relational among people, which still governs the way that many people think about power. Now, the state that he established eventually developed formally into this administrative state, which is depicted in maps like this. I told you I had a lot of maps. This depicts the 32 provinces that Afghanistan had until a couple years ago. It now has 34 provinces, but because this one and this one were divided, but it's hard to find maps showing that now. So this is the old 32 province map. These provinces were in turn divided into much smaller districts, approximately, I believe there are now 365 districts. There were some disputes about some of them, so the number is not certain. Now, the legal structure of this state was highly centralized. Now, this is something that's important to understand in trying to understand how people view the state in this area. Now, you remember at the beginning I showed you how the people are highly dispersed. They speak different languages. they're far from each other, communication and transport is difficult. So that's obviously a situation where to deliver services to people in an accountable way, you need a decentralized administration and it can be closer to people. So why do they have such a centralized administration? The answer is, it wasn't set up to deliver services to people in an accountable manner. It was set up to keep Russia away from the British Empire. It was set up to control the territory and to prevent the enemies of the Emir or the British Empire from ending the territory. If the people wanted services, fine, let them provide them for themselves based on their village organizations, their tribal organizations, donations from merchants. The government would provide basic security and keep enemies away. That was what it was for. It would guard the roads, it would guard the cities, and it didn't try to provide services to most of the people. So you have the paradox that the territory was divided in this way to exercise centralized control, to divide people up. Every governors are not elected, were not then, are not now. They are appointed from the center. They are accountable to the president or previously to the king, not to the people they govern. Same for district heads. Naturally, in such a system where there's no accountability to your constituents, there's a lot of corruption and abuse, of course. But the point is, this is a very weak state which has very limited functions, and it is not there mainly to be accountable for the people. So you have the paradox that government was extremely centralized, but governance was extremely decentralized. That is, government as an institution, an internationally recognized institution, was a highly centralized bureaucracy that had very little effect on the lives of most people. But the way that disputes were settled, resources were distributed and so on was highly decentralized based on local social structures which varied a great deal from place to place. Now, in the course of the events of this century, that administrative structure was largely broken down, and I to limit the number of maps, I've jumped ahead to the end of the Taliban period, but especially during the fight against the Soviet Union, there were numerous armed groups that developed as the Soviet Union, the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia all supported different armed groups. The state could not consolidate control over any area. Under the Taliban, who were supported by Pakistan, they succeeded in reconsolidating a highly centralized and extremely weak state over the Pashtun areas and eventually these areas as well. This is the area, a heavily Tajik area bordering on Tajikistan, which was still under the control of the Northern Alliance. These areas, some Uzbek and Hazara areas, had pockets of control by resistance to the Taliban, because again, the government was extremely weak. But that is what the map of Afghanistan of political control looked like on the eve of September 11th. Now, what then happened is that when the United States intervened, it intervened in order to destroy the assets of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Of course, bin Laden had come there as part of the joint US Pakistani-Saudi operation against the Soviet occupation in the 1980s. He wasn't, as people sometimes say overly in a simplified way, he wasn't supported by the CIA or paid by the CIA, but nonetheless he was supported by, to some extent, the Saudi intelligence agency, which was cooperating with the CIA, and by Saudi donors. And therefore he could operate within Pakistan without any problem. But so the US then destroyed the assets of al-Qaeda, the training camps and so on, and also removed the Taliban government from power, which was not very difficult because, remember, the state in Afghanistan is extremely weak, highly centralized, but extremely weak. So you often have a pattern in Afghanistan of governments or states collapsing and then being reconstituted relatively quickly because they're weak structures, and the society governs itself in large measure separately from the state. So when that central state collapsed, what happened was you developed areas of control, of power, by the people we call warlords, who are depicted here. It's not a very precise term, but let's just use that term here. Who constituted major networks of power, not around those 34 or 32 provinces, but around the major regions of the country, economic and social regions, organized around major cities, markets, and river basins. So you had Ismail Khan controlling the area of Herat in the west. You had some Pashtun warlords like al-Agha controlling, roughly speaking, not controlling very much, but having influence over the tribes around Kandahar. You had Kabul and the Tajik areas up here, Uzbek areas here, and Hazara areas here. And in this area, which is highly tribalized, you had a pattern of fragmented control. That's why I said it doesn't really explain what was going on in eastern Afghanistan. But now note that this map of power is quite different from the centralized map of the previous slide, which shows Afghanistan broken into little pieces. These people had significant amounts of power, and they also were linked to the neighboring countries, and by this time also to the United States, of course, which had supplied them with weapons. Now, we then went back and tried to reconstitute this centralized state, which was not something we forced on the Afghans. Many Afghans wanted it because they associated it with security. These warlords maybe were more representative, but they were also predatory and were responsible for a great deal of insecurity. I should go back again now. Let's see. Oops. Previous. And essentially, part of what we have been trying to do in the past 6 years is to turn this back into, not that, but this, okay, that. In other words, to have an administrative Afghanistan which is controlled by the center, which is in turn, and this isn't depicted on this map, linked to the international community through flows of aid and through the troop presence. Now, let me put this in a little perspective. In other words, to put in the background, Afghanistan developed its current state structure, territorially, administratively, basically through its interaction with empires, with the British Empire, then with the Cold War, and so on. After the Cold War, when the resource flows that were sustaining the Afghan government decreased because the Soviet Union stopped to exist, the United States disengaged, that state collapsed. Also, of course, there were all these armed groups that had been supported by various parties in the war. And people organized themselves in various regional lines and so on. Because the state was not functioning, an underground organization like al-Qaeda was able to establish itself there. When Osama left, he was forced out of Saudi Arabia in 1990. Then he went to Sudan. Even though Sudan was considered sort of an outlaw state at the time, finally he was forced out of Sudan in 1996. He went back to Afghanistan because there was no effective government there. There was no one to keep him out of there, and he was able to build up a base. He was then also used to some extent by Pakistan to aid the Taliban and to help them train people for Kashmir. But basically, Afghanistan and the tribal territories of Pakistan was an area where the state system wasn't functioning. Now, this was reflected in the economic realm as well, because just as people were not benefiting from the rights and security that states are supposed to provide, they also were not benefiting from the legitimate livelihoods that participation in the international economy is supposed to provide. So just as they resorted to sort of illicit armed groups, we call them illicit armed groups, or coalitions to provide them with some kind of makeshift security, they also resorted to illicit economy. And that is how the drug trade came to Afghanistan, because it was a source of finance. Well, first, of course, it was brought to Afghanistan by international drug traffickers. The international drug trade, by the way, is not caused by Afghan farmers, which you might think sometimes listening to some of our officials. But it was brought there by international drug traffickers, and then people were very receptive because warlords needed the money to pay for their political and military activities, and farmers and traders needed some kind of trade that they can engage in, despite the fact that the country had been so barely destroyed. And the main advantage Afghanistan had at that time was that it was one of the cheapest places in the world to produce illegality. So again, the same kind of situation of lack of functioning of the state system and of international legitimacy was reflected in the political, in the economic realm as well. Now, and then September 11th, I'll skip these. Okay, September 11th, you know what occurred there. On October 7th, 2001, I was sitting in an ABC News television studio in New York. That was the day that the American air war against Afghanistan started. And this image came on the television. This was Osama bin Laden's first global video after September 11th. And now, of course, he appears with a cloth background so nobody can hire a geologist and try to figure out where he is from looking at these rocks. He hadn't figured that out yet at that time. And what did he talk about? Now, it was very puzzling to many people what he said. He said, and this is one of the key points, of course it was a longer rambling speech, but he said, what the United States tastes today is a very small thing compared to what we have tasted for tens of years. Our nation, and the word he used in Arabic is ummah, which is not exactly nation, it means the Islamic community, not a nation state in the sense, in our political sense. Our nation, our ummah, has been tasting this humiliation and contempt for more than 80 years. 80 years, 2001 minus 1921. So what is he talking about? Well, what he was talking about is the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923 and the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, which we may not be that familiar with. But what did it do? Those were the treaties that divided up the Ottoman Empire, which was recognized by Sunni Muslims as the caliphate, that is the religious as well as the temporal leadership, and divided it up into protectorates of the British colonial powers, which then eventually became independent nation states. Now you see, here are the, this is Wilson and Clemenceau and so on at Versailles, so I'm just contrasting. This is what happened 80 years ago. These guys produced this map, which led him to say that. Now, this map you can see is very recognizably of the same genre as the map that I showed earlier depicting the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1901. That is, it is Europeans drawing lines across a territory in order to order their control and power over this area, including, very importantly, of course, the oil resources here, the sea lanes going through the Suez Canal, and so on, in their interest, and thereby dividing up the Muslim caliphate into these smaller units, and in the Treaty of Lausanne also providing that no power or jurisdiction in political, legislative, or administrative matters shall be exercised outside Turkish territory by the Turkish government or authorities for any reason whatsoever over the nationals of a territory placed under the sovereignty or protectorate of the other power as well as legal language, signatory of the present treaty, or over the nationals of a territory detached from Turkey. It means the Ottoman Sultanate and the Ottoman Caliphate is abolished. There's no caliph who has authority over the Muslims of all of these countries. So the Western colonial powers destroyed the caliphate, an Islamic institution, and substituted for it these colonies, which then became nation states. And this is what bin Laden is tracing the history of what he sees as the humiliation of Muslims back to. The destruction of the caliphate based in Istanbul, remember I started thinking about this at that conference in Istanbul, very far from the Durand Line, prepared the ground, in his view, for the catastrophe of the Palestinians. Of course, here we have the Palestine Mandate, which became Israel and then was partitioned and now is, again, fully, partly Israel and partly occupied by Israel. The sanctions and war against Iraq, a state which was demarcated within these borders for the first time, again at that period, and separated from Kuwait. And the occupation of what he calls the land of Muhammad, or the land of the two shrines, Mecca and Medina, by the United States and other Western powers during the Gulf War. So his grievance is not just against certain events or certain actions, it's against the structure of domination and control, of political structure and domination and control imposed on the entire Muslim world, and actually more than the Muslim world, by imperialism, which created the structures that we are living with today. Although they have, of course, now these are no longer protectorates or mandates of colonial powers, they are more or less independent states, but nonetheless, the existence of these territorial units within these boundaries, the secular nature of authority in them, regardless of whether they claim legitimation, of course, goes back to this process. Now, therefore, I think it's not a coincidence that this movement, even though it is led and founded by Arabs, mostly from this area, from Saudi Arabia, was founded in those borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan. You know, the first meeting of al-Qaeda was in Peshawar. Its first organizational meeting, which is in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. It became organized later in Khost, right across the Durand line in Afghanistan. And even today, then finally it developed its bases in eastern Afghanistan under the control of the Taliban, and first when it was uncontrolled and then under the control of the Taliban. And today, after being driven out of officially demarcated Afghanistan by the US-led coalition, Osama bin Laden is today in those federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan, whose inhabitants consider themselves to be both Afghans and Pakistanis, but accountable to neither of those two states. So again, he is sitting in an area which is, in a sense, outside the state system, expressing his protest against the entire state system in an area which, far from being isolated, backward, and so on, is actually integrated into the international system, but in a way which makes it an ideal site for protest. So let me just run through how that is. First of all, the economy used to rely on subsistence farming, in which land and animals were the main assets. Now it relies largely on a commercial single crop economy, that is opium, which is not a uniquely, it is illegal, but we should think of it as like other colonial crops, like sugar in Cuba, rubber in Liberia, tea in Sri Lanka. It's a single commercial crop which has linked the peasantry to the international market. And they have consequently abandoned their subsistence farming. It means that they move around, they have market contacts, and they're much more dependent on cash. Now, partly the incentive to be dependent on cash came from war. This was a war-accelerated development because war brings a lot of money in, it raises prices, it lowers productivity, it lowers the labor supply, and so on. So they needed cash. This is one way to get it. Traffickers and traders from all the major drug markets reserve their shares of the Afghan product through futures markets. In addition, again, these areas are not productive economically themselves, but part of their survival strategy in that area is every family includes migrants who are in the Pakistani city of Karachi, in Iran, or in the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, who send home their remittances to their remote villages through a very complex system called Hawala, which starts with electronic transfers from banks in the country where the people are working, and then goes through informal systems. Say a bank money is transferred from Dubai to Peshawar, but then it goes to informal traders who take it into the family inside a village. A very complex system, which is also extremely sophisticated and effective. So when I hear that Afghans lack capacity, I wonder, how many of these international aid workers would be able to send their salaries to a remote village with no electricity. And these remittances finance new houses and shops and so on. And the workers are separated for years at a time from their family, from their tribe, and from their village. They're in these cities, and they seek sociability, meaning, and protection in mosques where they meet global preachers of various kinds of Islam, but including this type. As I said, cash is reaching the whole area. Again, the fact that you have free cash means that there's resources available for building up military forces, for supporting movements of various sorts, things which were not possible before. So it's common enough for us now to observe that globalization has transformed sovereignty and has transferred functions of some states to larger organizations like the European Union, and shattered the weakened institutions of others who cannot compete in this globalized system. But it's less commonly realized, and I think maybe it's more, bin Laden's last video shows this, that bin Laden's vision of the caliphate is not just a reactionary call back to something that existed a long time ago. Of course, it existed about 80, 85 years ago, 90 years ago now, time passes, but is actually a cultural expression of a revolutionary response to globalization. Revolutionary is not meant to be a positive word here, I'm just saying, but a violent response, a protest response, the most extreme type of response, but still responding in a real way to the real situation of the modern world. The states that were drawn by the imperial powers on the territory of not only the Islamic Ummah, but actually most of the world that was colonized, have excluded large numbers of people from effective participation in nationhood. If you go to people in the border areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan and tell them that they're going to become citizens of a democratic nation state which is going to provide them with accountable service delivery, that will sound much less credible to them than if you tell them that they're going to become subjects of an Islamic caliphate. Because they haven't seen anything that remotely looks like a democratic, accountable state providing them with services. They see all kinds of people coming from capitals in foreign countries to use them and exploit them or dominate them for one purpose or another, or to give them money to get them to do things. But certainly, but the idea of an Islamic caliphate is actually more meaningful to them. It seems crazy to us from where we are, but in terms of their experiences, it seems maybe to some of them, not all of them, of course, not even most of them, I don't want to overly generalize, but there is a space for that idea to compete with these other ideas because, frankly, the ideas that we are pushing, that we are promoting, and which many of them would like to aspire to, are not that credible because those ideas, those institutions have not actually delivered to them. Now, this alternative utopia of the caliphate is also not going to deliver to them. It can deliver a lot of violence, but like other alternatives, it will not deliver. In fact, I think we make a mistake from a policy perspective in conflating that with other movements that use violence, as so many nationalist movements, nationalist political movements throughout history have used violence of various types, because after all, the movements of Palestinians, including Hamas, movements of Lebanese, including Hezbollah, the Iranian government, all those things are very closely related to national interest. Even also the Taliban in Afghanistan, at least originally, were closely related to political demands having to do with national interests, and that could, in principle, such as demand for an independent state or autonomy or greater power within a state or a different legal system, that could, in principle, be negotiated or accommodated in some way within the nation-state system in a way that bin Laden's revolutionary demands cannot. And therefore, unfortunately, by stigmatizing all of those movements as being part of this phenomenon we call terrorism, we eliminate the political option of dealing with them within the institutions that we have, which I believe in many cases does exist, and in a sense lump them all together and force them together in a way which was not really necessary. You'll find a lot of those groups are very anxious, including Iran, Hamas and so on, are anxiously trying to distinguish themselves from al-Qaeda and bin Laden and claim that they are also against September 11th, which I believe they are, and that kind of terrorism. But they have not found a political response in the United States because of the ideological way that we have responded to September 11th. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, we are engaged in a project of trying to help Afghans build a state that actually can deliver those goods to them, that can show them that the state structure that bin Laden is protesting against actually can deliver. But for the first several years, and even until now, we underinvested in that because the administration, for reasons I discussed this afternoon, I won't go into it now, had a different vision of what it was trying to do. It thought it was trying to kill and capture terrorists there, and then it was going to get to the root causes by forcing change in the Arab world through war in Iraq, which was based on a completely erroneous analysis of the problem, in my view, and an erroneous conception of U.S. national interest. In any case, it's now, I think, made us much worse off, and the result is we have not adequately invested in this area. The state in Afghanistan is still not delivering. The state in Pakistan is not delivering for the people in the tribal territories. Many people of those areas do, in fact, long to become citizens of states that would protect their rights and provide them with services. But as I said, for many others, it's harder to imagine that they might one day be citizens of effective, accountable nation states than that they might be joined with their fellow Muslims in a renewed caliphate. Meanwhile, somewhere in the mountains of the land that its inhabitants called Pakhtunkhwa, that is the land of Pakhtuns, neither Afghanistan nor Pakistan, Osama bin Laden is making his videos and sending them out to the entire world over satellite networks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Before we start taking questions, let me remind you that Professor Rubin will be here to sign the copies of his book after the end of the lecture. So if you would like copies of the copies that you have purchased to be signed by the author himself, he will be happy to do that. We have 2 microphones on the 2 aisles. Please come and ask your questions. If you could, please make them short, precise, and exact. And we have about 30 minutes to answer those questions. Thank you. Yes, please.
All right, so I kind of had a question on, you're kind of sure about Osama and where he is between Afghanistan and Pakistan, but I mean, isn't the truth he could be really anywhere right now, just putting the videos out, right?
Well, no. I mean, actually, there's a lot of information that indicates he is in that area, that certainly it's the consensus of, I mean, sometimes it's denied by President Bush, who says we have no idea who he is, who cares, who, you know, I don't think about him. But the consensus of the intelligence people that I talked to is that he entered those areas after Tora Bora in 2001. We now have a lot of testimonies from people who were with him and otherwise to the effect that he did. Clearly the signs of his organization are in that area. So, of course, I should qualify anything like that by saying he did not give me his GPS coordinates last night, or I would be a rich man, or a dead man, or perhaps both. But I believe that there's very strong evidence to indicate that he is in that area. President Karzai was asked when he was here last fall if Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan, and if he said, well, if I said yes, then my brother Musharraf would be angry at me. But if I said no, I would not be telling the truth.
Yes, please.
You talked a lot about the problems of how lines are arbitrarily drawn, but I was just wondering what you would suggest American foreign policy should be regarding this area, or what we could do to better relations or perhaps help this situation.
Okay. Well, of course, I can't fully answer that question in the time allotted. But let me first look at say a couple points about that. If I say that lines are arbitrarily drawn, it doesn't mean there's some other lines that are perfect, and if only those lines had been drawn naturally, then we wouldn't have any political problems. The fact that borders between states are artificial is not too surprising, considering that states are in fact the result of human artifice themselves. So therefore the borders between them also must be results of human artifice. So all borders are by definition artificial and arbitrary. They're not features of the natural world. There is no way of drawing borders so that people are not in conflict with each other. So the idea, for instance, that if you redrew the borders so the borders were where the ethnic lines on that map were, then it would be much more peaceful, is false. The most ethnically homogeneous country in Africa is Somalia. If you put all the Pashtuns in the same country, they would have no way of making a living, since they mainly make a living from smuggling across the border that goes through their territory. The same for the Baluch. It's not that there are other lines. The problem is that any lines are a method of exercising power and distributing resources, because lines around a state give that state certain property rights, give it the right to allocate rights among people in that area, and therefore it's not that they determine that there's conflict or otherwise there would be no conflict. They determine how the conflict, which would be there in any case, is structured. Now, I think what we can say is that the way that the borders were drawn in South and Central Asia, which are the borders of Afghanistan today, has determined a set of conflicts, including, very importantly, the conflicts between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the political struggles among Pashtuns over their identity, whether they have a national identity, a religious identity, a tribal identity, what their relationship is to the global system, what is their relationship to the two states of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The United States has been absent. This is not the only thing about U.S. policy, but I'll focus on this question. The United States has been absent for many years in having a political approach, not just to Afghanistan and to Pakistan, but to the relations between those two countries. To a great extent, we reduced our relations with those two countries to their relations to, are they for us or against us? Are they, I can't think the number of times I've been asked that question. Is President Musharraf with us or against us in the war on terror? The answer to that question is President Musharraf is with Pakistan, because he's the president of Pakistan. He's not the president of America, and he's not the president of anti-America. He's the president of Pakistan, and that is its own identity. However, that creates conflicts in the area which affect us, and because of our huge amount of power and resources, we can help people resolve conflicts. It doesn't mean we can always resolve them, but now there are some processes going on within the past year or so to try to address that. It didn't happen for the first 5 or 6 years again, and it's very late now. Things have escalated.
Please.
I have a question, since you're familiar with the culture there. I haven't seen the latest picture, but the picture that was released of Osama about a week ago, it's considered good to have gray hair for wisdom, and in their culture, it would not darken their beard. And also for a guy who's tethered to a kidney dialysis machine, to be as healthy as he looked in that picture and actually looked to have grown a little bit. I think we're missing on who is our real problem. I think we need to check into who put the put options against American and United Airlines just before September 11th. We need to find out who did not get the jets in the air to protect the Pentagon, and who placed the explosives in building number 7, which is a 47-story building, which magically collapsed at 5 o'clock on September 11th.
Well, I'm not going to comment on Osama bin Laden's hairstyle. As you can see from looking at me, I have a lot to learn in that department myself, and I'm not going to give him any lectures on the subject. The one thing I conclude from the video is that he's not dead. I don't think there's very good evidence for the kidney dialysis thing, although that's a story that has been around for a while. As for the various theories that you mentioned about September 11th, there are a lot of such theories. There's a theory that it was carried out by the Israeli Secret Service Mossad, and that all the Jews were warned not to go to work that day, and I must have not checked my email. I don't know. I didn't get the message, and I went down there anyway. So on. And generally, something I mentioned this afternoon, for many people in the world, it's difficult to believe that such a wealthy, powerful nation as the United States can actually be incompetent and make mistakes. But I think as Americans, most of us understand that it's not beyond our imagination that could happen. And, on September, nobody expected what happened on September 11th to happen. So they weren't prepared for it. Now, we should say they could have been better prepared. They should have been better prepared. But the fact that they weren't better prepared doesn't mean that there was a plot to make it happen.
Please.
Thanks. I was just trying to piece together the timeline, and I know you covered this, but when did the opium trade, really take off in Afghanistan?
Well, of course, something like that is progressive over the years. I think what we can say is there was always cultivation of opium poppy as what we might call a traditional crop in certain isolated areas of Afghanistan, as there were in other areas in Turkey, India, and so on. It was part of the local culture, cuisine, and so on. I just read an interesting article actually about the culture of poppy and cuisine in central Turkey. What happened in the 1980s is that due to increased political pressure from the United States, Turkey, Pakistan, and Iran, not only from the United States but led by the U.S., strictly imposed increasing restrictions on the cultivation of opium poppy. While, of course, the developed countries did very little, if anything, to decrease the demand for narcotics. So naturally, markets being markets, the traders wanted to satisfy the demand and they looked for a new place for production. Well, there was a very well-located country where the government had completely collapsed and there were a lot of military commanders who needed money. So they moved production, in particular from Pakistan into Afghanistan. Now initially, this was a move of opium cultivation, which is the least profitable part of the entire drug market. And the processing was still taking place mainly in the surrounding countries. In the late 1990s, for various reasons, more of the opium processing also began to move inside Afghanistan, partly because of the greater security under the Taliban, and then actually also in response to the Taliban ban on opium poppy cultivation, because that was a way of capturing more value from the process. And that has continued. So since about the late 1990s, the proportion of the Afghan produced opium that is processed into morphine or heroin inside Afghanistan has gone up to the point that the UN now estimates it's 72% of the entire crop. So it means that at this point, according to the UN estimates, about 80% of the value of the opiate market in Afghanistan is captured not by farmers, but by the traders, the processors, and the various armed groups, whether Taliban or corrupt people in the government, who are protecting them. Currently, this year, they believe that the crop, which again is only about 20% of the economy, is at record highs. And that means it might have an impact on lowering the revenue from trafficking because, of course, like any other commodity, when the supply goes up, the price tends to come down. And I think we can expect that next year, the United States will announce a huge success in counter-narcotics because there's so much produced this year that the price went down and therefore production will go down. And we'll see what happens the year after that.
Do you have a follow-up? Good. Go ahead, please. Please. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Rubin, for a very provocative presentation. Quite early in your presentation, you made reference to the apparent similarity between the motivations of people of European origin, perhaps originally from the Middle East, in the recent terrorist action or delayed action in Germany, and those of the worldwide free traders from anti-free traders. And for a moment, I was really excited by this possibility that there might be some kind of worldwide, really worldwide action to get at the real causes, the root causes of what so many people seem to be concerned about. And on top of that, shortly after bin Laden's recent video appeared, one of the commentators on C-SPAN or PBS, I'm not sure, was asked about what it all meant, what bin Laden's statement all meant. And just as I was kind of struck by his language, which that he thought had real Marxist overtones. And I don't know whether that's a serious measure of the way he and others feel, but I'd like to hear your point of view on whether you think that this worldwide action might eventually topple the, what many of us think are the corporate controlled world globalization masters of what's happening in so much of the world, whether they need to shudder at what might be coming their way. Thank you.
Well, first thing is that I think there is a possibility that various social processes underway now will, within the next century or so, topple this global order. But I'm afraid that what will replace it will not be necessarily something better. So let me give a little background. First, there's a common perception, again, I'm not trying to tell you what you think, I don't know what you think, but that I've seen in writings and discussions on television, that bin Laden represents, and movements like that represent something uniquely Muslim, extremist. It's a characteristic of some aspect of the Muslim world, and that all they're doing is trying to go back to some imagined past, as if they didn't exist in the political present. Now, the movements in particular that bin Laden's deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, comes from in Egypt, were part and parcel of the modern political scene in Egypt and the most advanced cities of the modern Middle East. That is, the Islamist movement did not develop like Taliban out of some village mullahs. It developed from intellectuals and universities. Remember, Ayman al-Zawahiri is from one of the most prominent families in Cairo. He's a medical doctor. His relatives are all medical doctors. He has scholars, university professors, politicians in his family, and so on. It developed as a way of competing with the Marxists for leadership of the anti-imperialist student movements. That's also what happened in Afghanistan. In other words, it was part of the general politics of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, nationalism, which took sometimes very right-wing forms of nationalism or quasi-fascist movements, sometimes very left-wing forms of communist movements, and sometimes religious movements. You may remember there are various groups in Iran that used to be called Islamo-Marxists. One of those Islamo-Marxist organizations, which has been branded by the State Department as a terrorist organization, Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the People's Mujahideen, is today being protected by the U.S. military in Iraq as a potential tool for use against the Islamic Republic of Iran. The boundaries that may seem very clear to us are much more porous on the ground. Now, in this talk, you may remember, there are a lot of things that Osama said that are not typical of Islamists. For instance, he didn't claim that the United States government and media are all controlled by the Zionists or by the Jews. He claimed they're controlled by capital. And the person he cited was, in fact, another Jew, Noam Chomsky. And that was for the left. For the right, he says, we know in America you're suffering from your taxes, which are too high, and your problems with high mortgage rates. Under Islam, taxes are low. So he's saying, if you really want to have tax cuts in permanence, you should choose Islam. Now, in other words, he is responding to some of the same problems that people in the anti-globalization movement are responding to on the left, that people in the anti-tax movement are responding to on the right, that is some of the real problems that we have in the world. Now, the solution that he proposes is something that he calls Islam. Now, what he means by Islam is not exactly what most Muslims mean by Islam. He means joining his movement. So when these German guys so-called convert to Islam to join al-Qaeda, they don't join Islamic culture and civilization and start living like, Pakistani middle-class people who have a history of devotion to certain types of Sufism or something. No, they join this organization. Part of the initiation ceremony is reciting the thing that makes you a Muslim, the kalama. So they become Muslims. But actually, it's just a rite of passage into joining that radical political organization. However, the fact that there are a large variety of ideologically and politically motivated groups, some violent, some nonviolent, some vanguard, some mass-based, all of which are responding to the same problem, does not mean they have any potential whatsoever for banding together to find a common solution. In a sense, both communism and fascism were responses to the economic and social crisis of Europe in the first half of the 19th century, but that did not lead to their banding together to bring about a better day for a common humanity. Certainly the whole history of leftist movements and nationalist movements indicates that, and I have no reason to think that the large range of movements that we see today is any different. But it does mean that the appeal that bin Laden is making is not solely a culturally based appeal to people in the Middle East or people of traditional Muslim background. He is trying to project his version of Islam as a political response to the crisis of the modern world, or problems of the modern world.
Please.
One of the factors for insecurity in Afghanistan is of course one of the factors, but in addition to that, how much do you believe that the foreign interferences from the neighboring countries, in particular neighboring Iran and Pakistan, escalating the security situation in the country? I also have a second question, if I'm permitted to raise that. And that's about the sources of terrorism. The government of Afghanistan, as well as some other international entities, are claiming that the main sources of recruitment and production of terrorism relates in Pakistan. How much the United States is committed in tackling those sources of terrorism in Pakistan? Thank you very much.
Okay. First, let me say the relationship of Afghanistan to the region is a very profound one, and let me just go back to a few points I made earlier. I talked about, I think I made this point at the beginning, that this territory, which became a state because of its strategic location, does not produce enough economically to support the cost of its own security. Now that doesn't have to be the case, because how much security costs depends on what the threats are. And in fact, Afghanistan did, not entirely, but largely pay the cost of its own security during the first half of the Cold War, although it received aid from the US and from the Soviet Union at the same time, but not to the extent that it is today, of course. However, that was based on a political consensus that all sides would support the monarchy in Afghanistan. They'd support different parts of the government. That broke down in the late 1970s. Since then, the country has been torn apart. Now the United States is building an army for Afghanistan. Well, there's a lot more to security than just an army, but let's just say the army as one component of it. That army is up to 5,000 men. It's not enough to provide security to Afghanistan in the current situation of threat. And yet, that army of 55,000 men costs much more to maintain than Afghanistan will ever be able to pay under any economic scenario. Therefore, under the current level of threat coming to Afghanistan from the globe and the region, and it's harder and harder to distinguish them these days, because Iran is in the region, but the conflict between the US and Iran is not a regional conflict, but that is also threatening Afghanistan. Bin Laden is from a different region, but he's there now, so the concept of region has become a little more difficult. But as long as this level of threat exists, that is, as long as the states and important militarized movements around Afghanistan do not support the government, do not see it in their interest to support the government of Afghanistan, or see some interest in undermining it, then Afghanistan will not be able to pay the cost of its own security and won't be able to have a sustainable state. And it's not, it would mean maybe Afghanistan could be stable if it had a permanent foreign presence. But I don't think anyone believes Afghans will accept a permanent foreign presence. So they were relieved, by and large, in 2001 because they didn't feel they were independent then. They thought they were already subjected to a lot of foreign interference and hoped that this would be a rescue mission. And nonetheless, we see in the protests against the rising level of civilian casualties and social tensions caused by a large number of Westerners in Kabul and other cities that there is a limit to how much they will put up with this. So it means that a fundamental condition for Afghanistan ever becoming stable again is creating a political consensus in the region in supporting a certain type of government in Afghanistan that everyone agrees that they can live with. So they all see stability as in their region. And above all, Pakistan, because of the relations of Pashtuns on both sides of the border and the strong relations between those two countries. There's one international official I know says, and President Karzai doesn't like him when he says it, but he still thinks it's true, Afghanistan will never be stable unless Pakistan wants it to be stable. I should add, it won't be stable unless Iran wants it to be stable, and the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard issued a clear statement today saying that if the United States attacks Iran, neither Iraq nor Afghanistan will be even as stable as they are today. Iran will do as much as it can to destabilize them as well, to hit American targets in those countries, and I would not want to underestimate what Iran could do there in response, again, to an attack by the United States. Now, as far as the sources of terrorism means different things, I think what you are referring to is primarily the report that came out from the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan a couple days ago, which was done by a couple of friends of mine, which is specifically about suicide bombers, which said that most of the suicide bombers in Afghanistan are not Afghans, although some of them are. They are Pakistanis or from Arab countries and so on. And they are mainly recruited and trained outside Afghanistan, that is to say in Pakistan, and specifically in those tribal territories of Pakistan. And I believe that that is the case. But it's not exactly true to say that therefore the sources of terrorism are entirely outside of Afghanistan. Because if Afghanistan had a state that was more effective and that people were more willing to support, those suicide bombers would not be able to enter the country so easily and to undertake those operations. So it is a combination of the internal weakness of Afghanistan and the regional situation that makes it subject to terrorism. But of course, the source of Osama bin Laden is not Pakistani and is not the result of Pakistani policy, even if he's been used by Pakistan at certain points. So there's no, the origin of his movement has more to do with the political situation in the Middle East on the one hand, and the opportunity presented by the collapse of authority in Afghanistan on the other.
Please.
Thank you, Professor Rubin, for coming and giving a wonderful presentation on Afghanistan. I think it's a treat to have this kind of discussion. I just had a question. I was curious with the title of your presentation, what's at stake in Afghanistan, why there was no discussion about oil. I know several years ago there was some discussion about oil pipeline going through the country. I don't know if it was Caspian Sea or what, but just curious what the status of that is, if it's been jettisoned or whether it's still on the works.
Well, the Caspian Sea is nowhere near Afghanistan. What you're talking about is there was a plan, and there still is a plan, for building a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan to Pakistan through western Afghanistan, and possibly an oil pipeline alongside it. If the United States really wanted that pipeline, there was a very simple way to get it: make an agreement with the Taliban to build it and build it. The Taliban wanted it. They actually were brought to the United States by UNICAL to try to lobby for that pipeline deal, and there was no obstacle to building it from the side of the Taliban. The obstacle was from the United States. Now, I think this is a general argument to remember. These wars, it's neither true that these wars are about oil or that they're not about oil. The wars in the Middle East are not about getting access to oil so that we can put gasoline in our cars. If you want to get oil to put gasoline in your cars, I can tell you a much cheaper way than having a war in Iraq. Buy it. Because Saddam Hussein and Iran are very happy to sell their oil. And if you did that, the prices would come down, and things would work much better. The problem is not oil. The problem is the oil money. What the U.S. government has been concerned about isn't that they can't get oil. They can buy oil. It's that the money from the oil will go to strengthen regimes that they consider to be strategic enemies. So they do not want their enemies to get a hold of those vital resources. It's not they're trying to enrich oil companies or car companies or something. It's control of a strategic resource because of its effect on power. Now, Afghanistan is more strategic than other countries that have the same miserable human conditions, like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Liberia and so on, because of its proximity to countries with nuclear weapons and the Persian Gulf. Therefore, it gets more resources. But the strategic game is really, I shouldn't call it a game, it's not that much fun really, but the strategic stake is controlling sources of power. But I went beyond that, and when I talked about what's at stake, what I mean is it's not just at stake who controls military access, who controls access to energy and things like that. There's now a contestation going on over the basic structures of the way the world is organized politically. Things that we take for granted are being contested, and because those institutions don't work for a lot of people, alternatives to them look somewhat credible. And so that I was trying to portray it in that light. The conflict over oil takes place within, in a way, the overall structures of the nation-state system, who gets to control important routes, who gets revenues, because that's what I said before, about drawing lines gives you property rights. If you're the sovereign of this territory, then in terms of international law, you have the subsoil rights to the minerals that are found in that territory, and you can tax them, and therefore you can get the revenue from them. So that is why the United States didn't want Saddam Hussein using those revenues from oil to build up nuclear weapons and intimidating Kuwait and other countries, and possibly attacking Israel, though he had no intention of doing that actually. And so on. So it was about power, but not just about gaining access to oil because it's a fuel.
Our last question, please.
On your blog, you mentioned that
This is the thing I've done which appears to have made me the most famous, and it's not necessarily the one I would have wished to be. But what happened is, for those of you who have not been trolling the internet about Iran recently, is that I got a message from a very good friend of mine who is quite a credible person, not a nut, who has a lot of good connections in Washington, which I know, who said that a friend of his at one of the leading neoconservative institutions said that they had received so-called instructions from Vice President Cheney's office to start a campaign for war with Iran, to build up support for war with Iran. He didn't say the decision had been taken. but to build up public support for a war with Iran starting after Labor Day. And if you observe it, the same public relations campaign that took place for war with Iraq in 2002 is now going on with respect to Iran, starting with a speech by the president, then it was the vice president, to a veterans organization, then it was the VFW, now it's the American Legion, which President Bush, August 29th, talked about danger of a nuclear holocaust coming from Iran, and all kinds of other things I could go into. Now, I don't know whether such instructions came out from the Vice President's office. I said on my blog, I cannot verify this, and I'm reluctant to put out things that are like alarmist rumors, but because of the stakes, I feel that I should do it and risk my reputation. So I'm doing this, and now I'm all over the internet and getting attacked at the National Review and the New York Sun, and God knows, and also people who I wish were not supporting me are also supporting me. That's worse sometimes. But clearly there is that danger. Iran thinks there is that danger. That's why they made this statement today. We have aircraft carriers there. Buried in General Petraeus' report was an attempt to blame Iran for a lot of the problems that we are having in Iraq, which, there's some truth to that, but, not that much. I won't go into detail. So I think there is a lot of evidence that there is a campaign to build up support for a war in Iran. I do not know, and I should say that doesn't mean an invasion of Iran. We don't have troops. It would be a quick air campaign. People also say that, there have been some Israeli flights over Syria recently, and people were wondering why Israeli warplanes are flying over northern Syria. Well, I got some messages today indicating this also may have to do with an attack on Iran. At any rate, as you know, there's such a thing as brinksmanship in diplomacy, which you threaten to do something you don't intend to do. But the problem, as I see it, is that the administration and its supporters have pretty clearly enunciated their goal in Iran, and it's not stopping the nuclear fuel cycle. It's overthrowing the government, regime change. And you can negotiate with the government, put pressure on it, try to get it to agree to do something that it's reluctant to do, like stop having a nuclear fuel cycle or withdraw from a territory. You cannot negotiate with the government over overthrowing itself. And the Iranians are convinced that that is the aim of U.S. policy. Therefore, they do not have any incentive to give in to any of these pressures because they think it is all aimed at overthrowing their government. And therefore, while I don't know if any decision has been taken or if there's any intention, given the way the policy is enunciated and the way things are developing, I think there is a serious danger of war, though not occupation.
Since Professor Rubin has had a long day, we will take the last question and then we wrap it. Please.
Rubin, thank you very much. I want to make sure I understand the oil situation. Right now, oil is the primary provider of energy, and it translates to money, as I understand you to say. So is it true then that even if we did not need oil, let's say this country would run on solar power or something, we would be trying to prevent other countries from spending their money in these countries to purchase oil?
If the technologies existed that we could produce energy without oil, oil would be worthless. So they can have as much of it as they want.
So why are we there? So does it come down then to oil?
No, it doesn't all come down to oil. There's no single, it is the presence of oil that makes that region more strategic. Yes, that is certainly true. But what makes it strategic is that oil produces power resources. That is, the government of Saudi Arabia is also getting a lot of money from oil, but they didn't try to overthrow the government of Saudi Arabia. And Saddam Hussein and the government of Iran were no less willing than the government of Saudi Arabia to sell oil to the United States. They would have been happy to do so. The reason we didn't get their oil is because we had an embargo against them. If we wanted their oil, we could just buy it. The reason that we want Saudi Arabia to produce oil, and we do not want Iraq and Iran to be able to sell their oil, is because we don't want the money from the oil going to strategic rivals, not because we need to grab the oil.